Each year, military medical personnel deployed to conflict zones encounter traumatic injuries that challenge even the most experienced combat surgeons, but there exists a category of wounds so disturbing and inexplicable that they're immediately flagged for investigation by military intelligence rather than standard medical protocols. It happens frequently enough that the Defense Intelligence Agency maintains a classified database of what they call anomalous combat trauma patterns, cases where the nature of injuries suggests something far beyond conventional warfare, or even known biological weapons. Operation Restore Hope, launched in December 1992, deployed over 25,000 American troops to Somalia in what was supposed to be a humanitarian mission to secure food distribution routes in a nation torn apart by clan warfare and famine that had already claimed an estimated 300,000 lives. For a brief period during the sweltering summer months of 1993, deep in the heart of Mogadishu's most dangerous district, a combat medical team from the 10th Mountain Division would encounter a series of patients with injuries so methodical and terrifying that it would force the Pentagon to acknowledge that something far worse than civil war was lurking in the ruins of Somalia's collapsed medical infrastructure. But what exactly had been created in the abandoned Soviet medical facilities that dotted Mogadishu's industrial sector? And why did an entire medical evacuation team vanish from official records after requesting immediate extraction with samples they claimed could threaten global biosecurity? Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia, sprawls across approximately 91 square kilometers along the Indian Ocean coastline, a city that had once been called the White Pearl of the Indian Ocean for its stunning Italian colonial architecture and pristine beaches. By 1993, it had transformed into something resembling the surface of another planet, a lunar landscape of shattered buildings, burned-out vehicles, and streets, controlled by heavily armed militias loyal to various warlords who had carved the city into feudal territories after the government's collapse in 1991. The Bakara Market District, located in the heart of Mogadishu's most densely populated areas, was particularly treacherous. A labyrinth of narrow alleyways and multi-story buildings where temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the smell of raw sewage mixed with cordite from constant gunfire created an atmosphere of perpetual danger. The 10th Mountain Division had established a forward operating medical station just 3 blocks from the market's northern edge, operating out of a reinforced former bank building that provided some protection from the RPG attacks that peppered the area almost daily. It is perhaps unsurprising then that this location, situated at the crossroads of desperation, violence, and the remnants of Cold War scientific ambition, would become ground zero for an encounter that would redefine the meaning of biological warfare. The history of medical experimentation in East Africa stretches back further than most care to acknowledge, with documented cases of unethical research programs dating to the Italian occupation of Somalia in the 1920s and 30s. During that period, colonial medical officers conducted studies on infectious disease transmission using Somali prisoners as unwitting subjects, research that was quietly buried in Vatican archives after World War II, but occasionally surfaces in declassified documents. More relevant to the events of 1993, however, was the Soviet presence that had dominated Somalia from 1974 to 1977, when the USSR maintained its largest military installation in Africa at the Berbera Naval Base and established numerous medical research facilities throughout the country. Somali elders in the Bakara market spoke in hushed tones about a particular clinic near the old industrial port, a concrete bunker-like structure the Russians called Obyekt 15, where local residents reported seeing trucks arrive in the dead of night, carrying what appeared to be human subjects and restraints. The facility had supposedly been studying something the Soviets referred to as Project Yar, Project Fury, though official records claimed the building was simply a tropical disease. research stations studying malaria and cholera. Nothing more sinister than standard epidemiological work that any nation might conduct in such a disease-prone environment. What made the Soviet facility particularly relevant was a series of incidents that had occurred in late 1976, just months before the Soviets abruptly withdrew from Somalia after backing the wrong side in the Ogaden War with Ethiopia. UN peacekeepers who arrived in the early 1990s discovered fragmented medical reports in abandoned government buildings, documents that described a mass psychotic episode involving approximately 40 individuals in the Port District who had simultaneously exhibited what physicians termed extreme aggressive dysphoria with analgesia, medical jargon meaning they became violently aggressive and appeared to feel no pain whatsoever. The Somali military police report from that incident, written in a mixture of Italian and Somali, described victims attacking with their teeth and hands, displaying coordination that suggested they were working in organized groups rather than acting as individual madmen. According to the fragmented records, the episode ended only after all 40 affected individuals were shot dead by government forces, their bodies immediately collected by Soviet personnel and transported to an unknown location, never to be seen again or mentioned in any official capacity. Similar encounters were reported by Italian medical missionaries in 1989 who treated several militia fighters, exhibiting bite wounds with unusual characteristics, semicircular patterns that were clearly human, but showed signs of jaw pressure far exceeding normal human bite force, as if the attacker's muscles had been operating beyond their natural limitations. These reports had been dismissed at the time as war trauma hallucinations or exaggerations meant to justify excessive force against enemy combatants, but they established a pattern that would soon become impossible to ignore. June 23, 1993, 0340 hours. The makeshift emergency room of the 10th Mountain Division's Forward Medical Station was experiencing what Captain Rebecca Holloway, the night shift trauma surgeon, would later describe as an unnervingly quiet period in a city that never truly slept. Captain Holloway, a 32-year-old general surgeon from Minneapolis who'd earned the nickname Ice for her unshakable calm during mass casualty events, had been working the overnight shift alongside Staff Sergeant Marcus Chun, a combat medic they called Stitch, for his legendary suturing speed, and specialist Amanda Reeves, a young anesthesiologist from Atlanta whose quick thinking had saved countless lives in the 3 months since deployment. The temperature inside the former bank building hovered around 94 degrees, despite 2 industrial fans running constantly, and the air smelled of antiseptic, sweat, and the faint sweet rotten odor that seemed to permeate every building in Mogadishu, regardless of how much bleach you used. They'd just finished treating a Pakistani UN peacekeeper for a minor shrapnel wound when the radio crackled with a call from a Marine checkpoint. About 8 blocks north, reporting they were sending in 2 Somali National Police officers with unusual combat injuries that their own medic couldn't properly assess. What arrived 20 minutes later, carried on stretchers by visibly shaken Marines, would fundamentally alter Captain Holloway's understanding of what the human body could endure and still continue fighting. The first patient was a Somali police sergeant named Bashir Osman, approximately 40 years old, who was restrained to the stretcher with cargo straps and still thrashing with such violence that it took both Marines plus Sergeant Chun to hold him steady enough for initial examination. His right forearm bore what appeared at first glance to be a severe dog bite, but as Captain Holloway cleaned the wound under the harsh fluorescent lights, she realized the bite pattern was unmistakably human. Perfectly preserved dental impressions, showing incisors, canines, and molars arranged in a semicircular arc approximately 5 inches across. What disturbed her immediately was the depth of the bite. Whoever had attacked Osman had bitten down with enough force to crack the radius bone, something that would require roughly 400 pounds of pressure per square inch, nearly double what the strongest human jaw should be capable of producing. The wound edges showed signs of tearing rather than clean cuts, suggesting the attacker had worried the flesh like an animal with prey. And there were 3 separate bite marks on the same arm at slightly different angles, as if the attacker had repositioned multiple times to get a better grip. The second patient, Officer Dahir Abdi, a younger man, perhaps 25, was conscious but in obvious shock. His left shoulder bearing an even more extensive injury, where an entire chunk of deltoid muscle had been removed, leaving exposed bone and severed vessels that Chun immediately began clamping to control the bleeding. What made both Marines and medical staff exchange nervous glances was Abdi's description of his attacker, delivered in broken English between gasps of pain. A Somali man in tattered militia clothing who had charged their checkpoint position at a full sprint, absorbed 3 AK-47 rounds to the chest without slowing down, and had bitten Osman while simultaneously using his hands to try to gouge out Abdi's eyes, all while making a continuous high-pitched keening sound that Abdi described as not human, like animal trapped in fire. The Marines confirmed they'd eventually killed the attacker with headshots, but not before he'd broken free from Osman's grip, despite having what should have been fatal thoracic trauma, and had tried to bite through one Marine's Kevlar vest before finally going down. Captain Holloway was irrigating Osman's wound, preparing to debride the damaged tissue, when Specialist Reeves called out in a voice that was trying very hard to stay professional, but couldn't quite hide the edge of panic. "Captain, I'm getting some really weird vitals on the sergeant here." Osman's heart rate had spiked to 170 beats per minute despite the sedatives they'd administered. His blood pressure was climbing into hypertensive crisis territory at 190/115, and his body temperature registered 104.3 degrees Fahrenheit, far too high to be explained by the ambient heat or infection that hadn't had time to develop yet. More disturbingly, his pupils were fully dilated, his jaw was clenching and unclenching with such force that they could hear his teeth grinding, and he'd begun sweating profusely, soaking through the sheets in a matter of seconds with perspiration that had an oddly chemical smell like ammonia, mixed with something organic and rotten. Chun was attempting to start a second 4-line when Osman's eyes suddenly snapped open, focusing on the medic with an intensity that made him instinctively step back. And in one explosive motion, the Somali sergeant tore through the cargo straps as if they were tissue paper, lunged forward, and sank his teeth into Chun's right wrist with such force that the sound of bones cracking was audible across the room. The combat medic screamed. Reeves grabbed a tray of instruments to use as a shield, and Holloway found herself doing something she'd never imagined in her medical career, driving a stainless steel retractor into a patient's temple with enough force to penetrate skull, an act of desperate self-defense that finally made Osman release Chun and collapse backward onto the gurney. In the terrible silence that followed, broken only by Chun's agonized breathing and the continued thrashing of Officer Abdi, who was now also showing signs of the same violent transformation, Captain Holloway stared at the blood covering her hands and realized with crystalline horror that whatever had attacked these men wasn't a disease or drug reaction. It was something that turned human beings into weapons that could only be stopped by destroying the brain itself. Captain Holloway's hands were still trembling as she wrapped Chun's mangled wrist in pressure bandages, the medic's face pale and sheened with sweat as Reeves administered morphine that seemed to barely touch his pain. The immediate aftermath of Osman's attack had descended into controlled chaos as 2 Marines burst through the door with weapons raised, forcing Holloway to explain through gritted teeth that she'd just killed a patient in self-defense, a phrase that felt obscene coming from a physician's mouth, but was undeniably accurate given the circumstances. Officer Abdi had been physically restrained using every leather strap and cargo tie they could find then sedated with enough propofol to put down a horse. Yet his vital signs showed the same terrifying pattern as Osman's final moments: spiking heart rate, hypertension, hyperthermia, and that strange ammonia chemical smell emanating from his pores. Holloway attempted to radio the main UNOSOM headquarters for guidance, using the proper medical emergency codes, but the response she received was bureaucratic deflection wrapped in military protocol. They should document everything, prepare samples for analysis, and wait for a medical intelligence team that might arrive sometime in the next 72 hours, depending on security conditions. When she tried to escalate by mentioning potential biological weapon exposure, the voice on the other end became notably more interested, but also more evasive, asking pointed questions about whether she'd secured all tissue samples and whether anyone outside the immediate medical team knew details of the injuries. The radio conversation ended with instructions to maintain operational security, treat this as a classified medical incident, and absolutely not discuss specifics with UN personnel or Somali National Forces. Directives that made Holloway realize with growing dread that whatever they'd encountered, it wasn't unprecedented, and someone higher up the chain of command knew exactly what they were dealing with, but had chosen not to warn forward deployed units. It was Sergeant Chun, despite his injury and obvious pain, who provided the critical breakthrough while Holloway was collecting blood samples from the two dead men for analysis. Working with his left hand, Chun accessed the laptop that housed the medical unit's reference database and began cross-referencing the symptoms they'd witnessed: extreme aggression, hypertension, hyperthermia, APPARENT analgesia, and the obsessive biting behavior that seemed to be the primary method of attack. What he found buried in a declassified Soviet medical journal from 1979, translated into English by military intelligence years ago, was a paper titled "Neurological Effects of Combined Stimulant and Rabies Virus: Exposure in Primate Models," authored by a research team at something called the Leningrad Institute of Experimental Medicine. The abstract described experiments using a modified strain of rabies virus engineered to accelerate the inflammatory phase while suppressing the paralytic phase, combined with massive doses of synthetic catecholamines, essentially creating a cocktail that would flood the brain with rage-inducing neurochemicals while keeping the subject mobile and aggressive far longer than natural rabies would allow. Even more disturbing was a footnote reference to field trials conducted at overseas research facilities, including Obayat 15, Mogadishu, Somalia, between 1975 and 1977, with results classified under Soviet military biological research protocols. Chun called over Lieutenant Danny Kaufman, their unit's intelligence liaison, who they called Prophet, for his uncanny ability to predict militia movements. And within 30 minutes, Kaufman had pulled up satellite imagery and old CIA briefing documents that confirmed Obayat 15's location, a Soviet-built medical facility approximately 2.3 kilometers southwest of their current position, in the industrial port district that had been abandoned since the government collapse and was now nominally controlled by Mohammed Farah Aidid's militia. The facility's official designation in Soviet records was Tropical Disease Research Station 7, but human intelligence reports from Somali defectors in the 1980s had consistently referred to it by another name entirely: Beit al-Ghadab, Arabic for House of Anger, where the Russians supposedly created soldiers who felt no fear and no pain, only an overwhelming compulsion to destroy anything living that came within reach. They had perhaps 40 minutes of relative calm before the second wave arrived, and this time it wasn't casualties being brought to them, but rather what sounded like the entire city erupting into sustained automatic weapons fire from multiple directions simultaneously. The radio traffic exploded with panicked calls from checkpoints reporting coordinated attacks by individuals exhibiting rabid behavior, moving in groups of 3 to 7, absorbing small arms fire without stopping using rudimentary tactics like flanking and suppression that suggested retained intelligence. Despite their obvious madness, Captain Holloway was making the decision to evacuate Chun and prepare for potential facility defense when the front entrance to their medical station simply exploded inward, the reinforced door torn off its hinges by what she initially thought was an RPG blast, but turned out to be 5 infected individuals who'd apparently worked together to physically batter it down with a piece of steel construction beam. The lead attacker was a woman perhaps 30 years old, wearing the remains of a Somali National Army uniform, her face locked in a rictus of what looked like agony, rather than rage tears streaming from bloodshot eyes, even as she charged directly at Specialist Reeves with fingers hooked into claws. The Marines opened fire, immediately sent her mass shots that punched through the woman, but didn't slow her momentum, forcing one Marine to sweep her legs with his rifle, while the other delivered a point-blank shot to the head that finally stopped her. But the other 4 were already inside, spreading to different corners of the room with tactical awareness that was terrifyingly at odds with their apparent insanity. And Holloway watched in horror as one of them deliberately positioned himself between the Marines and the medical staff, using his own body as a shield so his companions could close distance. Lieutenant Kaufman solved the immediate problem by grabbing a surgical cauterizer and jabbing it into one attacker's eye socket, the smell of cooking brain tissue filling the air as the body collapsed, while Chun one-handedly wielded a bone saw to devastating effect against another. They killed all 5 attackers within 90 seconds, but the cost was apparent. 2 Marines wounded, their facility compromised, and the certain knowledge that this wasn't an isolated incident, but rather some kind of outbreak that was spreading through Mogadishu with terrifying speed. The decision to move toward Obayek 15 rather than wait for extraction was made by Captain Holloway with a clarity born of desperate logic. If this was indeed an outbreak originating from the Soviet facility, then any potential treatment antidote, or at minimum intelligence about what they were facing, would be found at the source, and waiting in their compromised position would only result in being overwhelmed by successive waves of infected. Lieutenant Kaufman managed to raise a quick reaction force on the radio, but the response was devastating in its implications. Every American unit in Mogadishu was currently engaged with infected attackers. The UN compound was under siege, and Pakistani peacekeepers had reportedly abandoned their positions entirely after losing 30% of their force in the first hour. The QRF commander, a Captain somebody from the 75th Rangers, told them in blunt terms that nobody was coming to extract them anytime soon. But if they could reach Obayek 15 and secure any research materials or samples that might explain this outbreak, it would be considered a priority intelligence objective, and extraction would be arranged once they signaled mission complete. So at 0510 hours, as the sun began rising over a city that now sounded like a war zone, experiencing its final death throes, 6 people climbed into a damaged Humvee that the Marines had been using as a checkpoint vehicle. Captain Holloway, Sergeant Chun with his ruined wrist, Specialist Reeves, Lieutenant Kaufman, and the 2 Marines. Corporal Vincent Hayes, who they called Preacher for his habit of quoting scripture, and Lance Corporal Tanya Morrison, Ghost, for her ability to move silently. The 2.3-kilometer drive through Mogadishu's industrial district took 45 minutes instead of the expected 10, forcing them to navigate around burning vehicles, abandoned militia checkpoints, and at least 3 groups of infected that charged their Humvee with such single-minded determination that Morrison had to lean out the turret and deliver precision headshots while the vehicle was still moving. What they found when they finally reached the Soviet facility made every one of them wish they'd taken their chances waiting for extraction instead. Obayek 15 was a squat concrete structure that looked more like a Cold War bunker than a medical facility, surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence that had been torn down in multiple locations. Its main entrance, a heavy steel door that hung open on broken hinges, as if something had burst outward with tremendous force. The building's exterior walls were pockmarked with bullet holes from various calibers spanning decades, and the ground around the entrance was littered with spent shell casings, dried blood stains that looked months old, and disturbingly fresh drag marks leading inside that suggested recent activity. Lieutenant Kaufman took point with his M4 raised, entering through the main door into a reception area that had been thoroughly ransacked. Filing cabinets overturned papers scattered everywhere, many bearing Cyrillic text and medical diagrams that Holloway couldn't immediately interpret. The smell inside was beyond description, a combination of decomposition, chemical preservatives, human waste, and that same ammonia chemical odor they'd noticed on the infected, concentrated to the point where Reeves had to pull her shirt over her nose to avoid gagging. They moved deeper into the facility clearing rooms, one by one, finding what appeared to be examination rooms with restraint tables still bearing, leather straps crusted with old blood, a laboratory with broken glassware and centrifuges that had been violently destroyed, and a storage room filled with Soviet-era medical equipment that looked like it had been thoroughly looted. It was Corporal Hayes who found the stairwell leading down, a concrete shaft descending into darkness that exhaled cold air, carrying the unmistakable sound of movement from below. Not footsteps exactly, but a rhythmic scraping and what might have been breathing, or possibly multiple people breathing in near-perfect synchronization. Sergeant Chun, his face pale and sweating from pain and early-stage infection, symptoms that Holloway was trying desperately not to acknowledge, pointed out dark stains on the stairwell walls that looked like dried blood mixed with something else, a yellowish residue that fluoresced slightly under. Morrison's tactical flashlight. They should have left right, then called in an airstrike on the location and hoped that whatever was down there would be destroyed. But Kaufman was already descending the stairs, driven by the terrible certainty that the answers they needed and the samples that might save lives were somewhere in that darkness below. The basement level of Obyte 15 was a horror that seemed designed by someone who understood both medical science and psychological torture in equal measure. A warren of interconnected rooms that had clearly served as holding cells, operating theaters, and observation areas where Soviet researchers could watch their test subjects through one-way mirrors. The walls were covered in Cyrillic, writing some of it official medical notation, but much of it appearing to be desperate scrawling by subjects who'd retained enough sanity to document their own deterioration. Day 7, I can feel it changing my thoughts. They inject us again today. The burning is worse. I want to hurt them. I want to hurt them so much, it feels like my skin is on fire when I don't. But what froze everyone in their tracks was the central chamber, a circular room, approximately 40 feet in diameter, with a raised observation platform, and in the center, 17 human beings arranged in a perfect circle facing outward, standing absolutely motionless, in a silence so complete that it felt like a physical presence. These were not freshly infected individuals exhibiting the frenzied aggression they'd witnessed earlier, but rather what Holloway immediately recognized as late-stage subjects, people who had survived the initial violent phase and progressed into something far worse. Their skin had taken on a grayish pallor with visible vascular patterns suggesting massive inflammation. Their eyes were clouded white with cataracts, but still tracked movement with disturbing precision, and their mouths hung open, revealing teeth that had been filed or broken into jagged points. Whether by themselves or by researchers was unclear. What made the scene transcend from merely horrific to absolutely nightmarish was the realization that these 17 were communicating, using a series of clicks, hisses, and that high-pitched keening sound to coordinate, and they had been waiting in this formation specifically because they knew someone would eventually come looking for answers. Lieutenant Kaufman raised his weapon, but Corporal Morrison grabbed his arm, whispering, "They're between us and the only exit. The stairs are behind them. If we fire, they'll rush us, and we'll never make it out." And in that moment, everyone understood that they had walked into a trap set by something that retained enough intelligence to plan, but had lost every trace of mercy or humanity that might have stayed its hand. The 17 infected stood motionless for exactly 12 seconds, a pause that felt like an eternity compressed into a handful of heartbeats. And then, they moved as a single organism with a coordination that defied everything Captain Holloway understood about human neurology and group behavior. But what saved the medical team in that critical moment wasn't firepower or tactics. It was Sergeant Chun's deteriorating condition finally reaching its crisis point. He collapsed backward with a seizure so violent that his helmet cracked against the concrete floor, and the sound combined with his uncontrolled threshing created a stimulus that the infected apparently found more compelling than their organized ambush. 3 of the 17 broke formation and rushed toward Chun with such single-minded focus that it created a gap in their circle. And Corporal Morrison made an instantaneous decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, grabbing a thermite grenade from her vest and throwing it directly at the convulsing medic. The white-hot chemical fire erupted with a light so intense it temporarily blinded everyone in the underground chamber, and in the chaos of burning flesh and inhuman screaming, Lieutenant Kaufman physically dragged Holloway toward the gap while Hayes and Reeves provided covering fire that turned the narrow corridor into a kill zone of ricocheting bullets and falling bodies. They made it to the stairwell with infected literally grabbing at their ankles, Morrison dropping 2 more thermite grenades behind them to create a wall of fire that would buy precious seconds. And somehow, all 5 surviving team members burst out of Obaid 15's main entrance into the brutal morning heat of Mogadishu, just as a pair of AH-6 Little Bird helicopters appeared overhead their miniguns, opening up on the facility's entrance with a roar that drowned out even the screaming from below. Captain Holloway found herself on her knees in the dirt, gasping for air that tasted like cordite and burning chemicals, watching the little birds make pass after pass, pouring thousands of rounds into the Soviet facility until the entrance collapsed, entirely sealing whatever remained inside beneath tons of concrete and steel. The extraction happened with a speed and efficiency that suggested it had been planned long before their radio call. 2 Black Hawks touching down in a clearing barely 100 meters from Obaid 15, within minutes of the little birds establishing a perimeter. But these weren't standard Army helicopters crewed by the usual pilots and crew chiefs. These were unmarked aircraft, with door gunners who wore no unit patches or name tags. And the officer who jumped out before the skids even touched ground was a full colonel with a USAMRIID patch, United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, which meant biological weapons specialists, the people who dealt with things so dangerous that conventional military forces weren't read into the protocols. Colonel Richard Sorensen, a lean man in his 50s with a cold, evaluating eyes of someone who'd seen biological nightmares that would break most people's sanity, took one look at the team covered in infected blood and immediately ordered them into isolation pods that had been preloaded into the 2nd Black Hawk, essentially plastic coffins with their own air supply and decontamination systems. Holloway tried to protest, tried to explain about the research materials they'd seen in the facility, about the evidence of Soviet biological weapons programs that violated every international treaty, but Sorensen cut her off with a single sentence that made her blood run cold. "Captain, we've known about Obaid 15 since 1977, and this is the 4th time we've had to sterilize it, because some warlord or militia group got the bright idea to weaponize what the Soviets left behind before they were sealed into the isolation pods." Holloway watched through the Black Hawk's door as a flight of F-16s screamed overhead. Captain Rebecca Holloway spent the next 47 days in a biosafety level 4 containment facility at Fort Detrick, Maryland, undergoing a decontamination, an observation protocol so invasive and thorough that it felt more like punishment than medical care blood draws. Every 6 hours spinal taps, every other day, is psychological evaluations that felt designed to determine not whether she was traumatized, but whether she would stay quiet about what she witnessed. The official after-action report, filed with UNOSOM Command, stated that the 10th Mountain Division medical team had been attacked by Somali militia forces using conventional weapons, had sustained casualties including Sergeant Marcus Chun, who died heroically defending wounded personnel, and had successfully completed their mission before being extracted without incident. There was no mention of Obayak 15, no reference to infected individuals exhibiting signs of biological weapons exposure, no acknowledgement that an entire section of Mogadishu's industrial district had been obliterated by American airstrikes, ostensibly targeting a weapons cache that intelligence later claimed belonged to ID's forces. Specialist Amanda Reeves was medically retired from the Army 3 months after returning stateside diagnosed with severe PTSD and delusional disorder featuring persecution complex and false memories of biological warfare, a diagnosis that conveniently made her testimony about the incident inadmissible and unbelievable should she ever try to go public. Lieutenant Danny Kaufman received a Bronze Star for valor in combat operations, was immediately transferred to a desk job at DIA headquarters in Washington, and was found dead in his Georgetown apartment 18 months later from what was ruled a suicide by gunshot, despite the fact that his service weapon was never located and he'd left no note. Corporal Vincent Hayes requested immediate discharge after his tour ended and returned to his family's farm in Kentucky, where he became increasingly reclusive and paranoid, eventually refusing to leave his property and reportedly sleeping with loaded weapons under his pillow, convinced that they were monitoring him to ensure he never spoke about what had really happened in that Soviet facility. Lance Corporal Tanya Morrison was the only one who seemed to adapt to the aftermath, accepting a position with a private military contractor that primarily worked on classified government projects, though those who served with her afterward noted she'd developed a peculiar habit of always checking exits in any room she entered, and would sometimes stop mid-conversation to count the people around her as if ensuring none of them were moving in suspicious coordination. The physical evidence from Obayak 15 was reportedly destroyed in the airstrike, what Captain Holloway learned from a sympathetic USM Raid researcher during her quarantine that the real materials had been extracted by a specialized team 2 hours before the bombing, spirited away to an undisclosed location where analysis could continue without the inconvenience of international oversight or ethical review boards. The families of the Somali victims were never notified of the true cause of death. Their loved ones simply added to the official casualty count of clan warfare and attributed to the general chaos of a failed state where death records were suggestions rather than requirements. The complete medical documentation of the incident, including Holloway's detailed notes, blood samples, and photographic evidence, was classified under a special access program that required presidential authorization to view, effectively ensuring it would remain buried for at least 50 years under national security exemptions. What haunted Holloway during the sleepless nights in her containment cell, and what would continue to haunt her for the rest of her career, was the realization that Colonel Sorensen's casual mention of the fourth time meant this had happened before, multiple times, which suggested that whatever the Soviets had created in their Proyektorek program hadn't been fully destroyed when they abandoned Somalia in 1977, but had instead been left behind like a landmine waiting for someone desperate or stupid enough to trigger it. Intelligence analysts theorized that local warlords had been accessing the facility periodically since the government collapse, attempting to reverse engineer the Soviet biological weapons for use in clan warfare, creating periodic outbreaks that required American intervention and sterilization operations disguised as routine combat actions. The final, most disturbing piece of information came from a sealed appendix to her debriefing report that Holloway was allowed to read but not retain copies of. Similar facilities had been identified in at least 6 other former Soviet client states across Africa and Central Asia, all of them supposedly monitoring for signs of similar outbreaks, all of them representing potential future incidents that would require the same brutal calculus of containment, elimination, and official denial that had been applied in Mogadishu. She was released from quarantine with a clean bill of health, a promotion to major orders, transferring her to a medical research position at Fort Detrick. That was clearly designed to keep her close and monitored, and the unspoken understanding that her oath to do no harm had been permanently complicated by the knowledge that sometimes protecting humanity required accepting that certain truths could never be publicly acknowledged, and certain horrors could only be fought in the shadows by people willing to carry the weight of necessary sins. In the end, the 17 figures they'd encountered in that circular chamber beneath Obyekt 15 were never definitively explained as either the final surviving subjects of Soviet experimentation or a new generation of infected that had achieved some terrifying evolutionary adaptation. But either possibility suggested that humanity had created something that couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be cured, and could only be destroyed with extreme prejudice before it spread beyond containment. A biological weapon so perfect in its design that it turned human beings into self-replicating weapons, driven by an agony so profound that the only relief came from inflicting violence, and the truly terrifying question that kept intelligence analysts awake at night was whether the Soviets had managed to create similar programs elsewhere that were still waiting to be discovered, or worse, whether other nations had successfully reverse-engineered the technology and were simply waiting for the right moment to deploy what might be the most effective terror weapon ever conceived. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.